Hello everyone, thanks for watching. This is the special interview with His Excellency Mózes, the Hungarian Ambassador to Korea. All right, let us start. Okay. The first question is, I understand your love for Korea is really, really special. Not only as Hungarian Ambassador to Korea, but you're also a renowned scholar of Korean studies. What made you pursue Korean studies and what fond memories while studying?
When I was university student in the middle of the 1990s in Budapest, my major was history and international politics. And I really interested in the history affairs of East Asia, especially the history of the Korean Peninsula, because the history of Korea was very rarely known at that time. Books about the Korean history was not available at that time. There were no Korean department at the university, and there were no lecture about the Korean history. But I really interested in, because when I started to started to read about the Korean history, I felt obvious similarities between the situation of the Korean Peninsula and Hungary. The both location, the both region is located among big powers. Okay. The Korean Peninsula is between China and Japan, but if you see historically, from the period of the Three Kingdoms, the Korean region received a lot of foreign repression from Sunara, Tangnara, and Goranjok and Yojinjok, and later from the Mongolian Empire.
So many attacks and intrusions from others.
Yes. And the situation is very similar in the case of Hungary, because when the first Hungarian kingdom was established in the year 1000, from that time Hungary received a lot of foreign attack and repression from both sides, from west and from the east. I really felt similarities with the situation of the Korean Peninsula. And that's how I decided to learn about the Korean history more. And to understand the Korean history, it was very important to learn the Korean language, because it's impossible to understand the Korean history without knowing the Korean language. And that's how I started to learn Korean language in the late 1990s from my elderly Hungarian scholar Gábor Oswald, who is my first Korean tutor. And later I received opportunity from Korean organizations to learn here in Korea.
I see. I assume in the 1990s there were not much opportunity to learn Korean or exposed to Korean culture as well. Wasn't it that too difficult to observe, to grasp idea about how to learn Korean language at that time?
When I started to learn from the mentioned Korean scholar Gábor Oswald, I looked for opportunity to practice my knowledge with Korean person, particularly a young Korean person, and that's how I met in Budapest with a young Korean female who is now my wife.
Oh, okay, that's how it starts. All right, so impressed. Okay, so she was originally your Korean teacher. That's best teacher I ever thought about. Thank you. All right. So, what has been your main focus since you took up your post? Please share with us if there are some goals set for this year and the progress so far.
Yeah, so I was appointed for this position in the year 2018. It was my very great pleasure to use my knowledge about the Korean culture and Korean language to make the relation much better and to establish new ties between Hungary and Korea. In the last year, in 2019, we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the diplomatic ties between Korea and Hungary. 30 years ago, in 1989, we were the first among the former socialist countries which established ties with South Korea. So that's why I had some very important goal for this special year for the 30th anniversary. One of the goals was to establish direct flight between Hungary and Korea, and it was successfully established by the LOT Polish airline, and the Korean Air, Hong Kong, will start this service from the next year. Especially they wanted to start it from this year, but because the coronavirus situation, it was delayed for the next year. And one other of my goals as an ambassador here was to establish the first ever Hungarian Cultural Institute here, and it was successfully established in Myeongdong. The location was chosen personally by me, and everybody who is interested about the Hungarian culture and the history of the Hungarian-Korean relation are mostly welcomed in the Hungarian Cultural Institute in Myeongdong. And one more important thing, that we established the Hungary Research Institute at the Dankook University in Korea, and it became one more center of the Hungarian studies here in Seoul. So I think we are successfully in the field of improving ties between the two countries.
Yes, personally, I look forward to participating in the Hungarian Culture Institution if the coronavirus situation has been better than this.
Yes.
I look forward to that. All right, I read about the article that you established the first Korean Studies course in Budapest University in 2008. Would you tell us more about that story?
Yeah, it is the first ever Korean department which was established. So since when I started to learn Korean culture, Korean history and Korean language, I had a goal to establish a real Korean department in Hungary, to give opportunity to the students to learn more about Korea, to learn not only the language, but to learn about the Korean history, culture, modern culture, and also traditional culture and Korean national identity. And the most important, from my point of view, it was the most important to give opportunity for the students to feel the common sense and the common situation with the Koreans. So there are so many similarities, not only in the history, but so many similarities in the culture. It's rarely known that we were also an Asian nation. The Hungarians are the only nation in Europe which was coming from Asia. So that's why we are writing the family name first and the first name lastly, like the Koreans. Yes. And there are so many similarities in the culture. So that's why I wanted to give opportunity for the students to learn more about Korea. And the BA course was established in 2008. I prepared the MA Szokszakvacsong class in 2012, and I prepared the PhD for Korean Studies in 2017.
Oh, I see.
And as far as I know, not only in the Budapest University, but in some other university, there are interests now in Hungary to establish Korean faculties, Korean departments. And a lot of Hungarian students are interested in the Korean studies.
Culture. Yes. I think so. All right. So you mentioned about the Korean culture. The young generation is really they like the Korean culture. And I heard that Korean TV drama 대장금 was in the air in Hungary as the first country in Europe. So what do you think about the K-culture wave and image of Korea recently?
Yes, so in 2008, Hungary was the first among the European Union countries which shown Korean TV drama in the public broadcast. And particularly I was responsible to compare the original Korean script with the Hungarian translation, because the Hungarian translation was not made by directly from the Korean version, it was made from the English version. So I was responsible in my capacity as a university professor of Korean studies to compare the original Korean version and the final Hungarian translation. It was a very interesting and very successful job. And not only in the case of Daejangum, but in the case of Songdong Yovang, Queen Songdong, which was the second Korean Saguk drama, which was available in Hungary, and also in the case of Dongi, and the case of Isan.
Oh my gosh, so many
and it was rebroadcasted so many times. So only Daejangum was rebroadcasted 6 times. And now still available in cable television channels.
It's still going on?
in cable television channels, because there are so many fans, and not only the younger generation, but the elderly people also. Why? Because, as I mentioned before, we were also an East Asian nation. Our culture is coming from Asia, and there are so many similar values. The importance of the family, the importance of the family relation. The relation with the parents. So that's why, that was one of the reasons why the South Korean historical dramas were very popular in Hungary and still popular.
I see. I think for Hungary and Korea also, we are so lucky to have you as the final translator, as examiner for that script, because we all know the translation is the most important thing to let them know the new culture and it's in an authentic way, in a right way. So I'm so assured that you are deeply involved in the TV drama production in Hungary. So. Oh my God, I really appreciate your efforts and time and your passion for the cultural bridges between two countries. Okay. Would you share your valuable thoughts on the improvements of Korean society, if you have any, such as cultural aspects, highly competitive society, and any advice on the true development of Korean society, if you felt?
Let me answer for this question, not as an ambassador, but as a Korean scholar. You know, I'm responsible not only for South Korea, but I also representing Hungary as an ambassador in North Korea.
Yes, a very rare case,
Yeah, it's a very special case. And in my opinion, as a Koreanist scholar. It's very important to keep and to build a common Korean national identity for the South Koreans and the North Koreans.
Okay.
South Korea and North Korea is living separately more than 70 years ago.
Yes.
And the national identity is going to different ways.
Yes.
And to keep and to establish a common national identity, for that goal, one of the most important thing is to unify the Korean history. It's mean to unify of the point of views about the 5,000 years of Korean history. If you see a North Korean textbook and if you see a South Korean textbook, there are some differences in the interpretation, and it will be very important to create a common interpretation, a joint interpretation of the Korean history. And from that point of view, the role of the seminars and conferences where South Korean history professors and North Korean history professors are available to participate together is very important.
Yes.
And as I heard, the Koryomal Sajon project is going well, started well. It's very important, and of course the research, the joint research for the Korean history in the Kaesong region for the Palace of Manvolde, also very important. So in my capacity as a Koreanist scholar, not as an ambassador, I just suggest to my Korean colleagues to try to find opportunity to establish joint researches, joint seminars, and joint conferences.
I can't agree with you anymore. This is really important to have a uniformity regarding the perspectives of a historical angles as a one nation, one country. And it was really deeply impressive, valuable thoughts from you as a scholar, also as an ambassador of both sides. All right, it gives me another, I think everyone who watched this video and can get the hints and the inspiration from your valuable thoughts. All right, that was my last questions. Do you want to say anything as a last word?
Just thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you very much for calling me, and it will be my very great pleasure to meet you again and to talk about the Korean studies again.
Oh yes, I'm also personally really great honor to meet you in person, and through this interview it was really great opportunity. All right, thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye bye.